where we left off was this is in commemoration of Earth Day. And so our featured speaker today will be Scott Dewey. And Scott will be followed by a distinguished group of panelists who will reflect on what Scott presents and bring with that reflection their own twist in terms of how they see this issue through their own experience. And that includes Dennis Delie, who's Secretary Treasurer of the Wisconsin State AFL-CIO, Marc Rosenthal, who's with the Sierra Club, and Pam Fendt, who is the president of our Milwaukee Area Labor Council. I just want to remind everybody that we'll also have on May 1st, Sunday, our Bayview tragedy commemoration, and that will be held in person this year. Those of you who received the flyer and bothered to pay the video, am I okay? Yep, all right. And bothered to play the video, might have heard Candace indicate that the commemoration this year would be held virtually, but this is it's a video from a couple of years ago. So we just put it into the flyer to make it interactive, and it has a wonderful history connected to it, along with Candace's narration. But it will be in person. It'll be at the regular location at the historical marker site at South Superior and East Russell Avenue. Without further ado, just to also mention, we'll have our annual meeting following the program part of this meeting. Those of you who are not members are certainly welcome to attend. During that meeting, we'll be having elections. We'll have our financial report, our membership report, etc. So please attend if you so desire. Without further ado, I'm going to turn the meeting over to John Shelton, who's our board member and assistant professor up at UW Green Bay. And he'll be introducing Scott Dewey. And after Scott's presentation, Jacqueline Kelly, who's our secretary and board member, will be introducing our panelists and also moderating the panel. So welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for participating. And John, take it away.
Thanks, Steve. And I'll just let everybody know I did get promoted a couple of years ago, so I'm an associate professor now. But
oh, all right.
Yeah, and I'll try not to talk about origami. But Ken, you should, in case this person comes back, you should have the capability to change the permission so that people have to ask to unmute themselves. I think you have to do that as host, but if you might want to just consider being able to do that in case this person comes back, because I think Harvey's right. It could be somebody who's intentionally doing this. But anyway, it is my great pleasure to introduce Scott Dewey, who's our featured speaker today. Professor Scott Dewey is a faculty research librarian at the University of Minnesota Law School. Scott holds a PhD in 20th century US history and environmental history from Rice University and has taught courses on both US and environmental history. He's an expert on the history of air pollution and the author of the book entitled Don't Breathe the Air, Air Pollution and US Environmental Politics, 1945 to 1970, as well as other important publications that consider the connection between labor and environmental politics, which is why we are thrilled to have him here today for our spring conference. In the week that, as Steve mentioned, we celebrate Earth Day, which is the brainchild, at least partially, of a progressive Wisconsin governor and senator, Gaylord Nelson. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Professor Scott Dewey.
Thank you, John, and everybody. And let me see if I am, in fact, able to screen share. It looks like, okay, great. have a PowerPoint set up so you don't just have to watch a talking head for too many minutes here. So hoping this will. My apologies. I have it up and running on my computer. I don't know why the delay. Oh, here we go, maybe. That looks promising. Let's see.
We can see it now.
Okay, there it is. Finally ready to go, I think. As you heard already, hi, I'm Scott Dewey, and thanks for inviting me to be with you this morning. I'm a former Californian now living in Minneapolis, but I'm actually also a 4th or 5th generation working class Wisconsinian. My mother was an early day latchkey child who had to hide out after school for fear that municipal authorities in Milwaukee would find kids with no adults at home, because her mother was in a coma after the last really bad encephalitis epidemic. Yeah, it hit the Midwest and was institutionalized for life. Her father left school in the 8th grade to help support his widowed mother. He was working his way up toward the American dream in the 1920s, and then lost basically everything: his new home, his Model A Ford, his wife in the Great Depression, and thereafter drank and smoked himself to death at an early age. He couldn't get a job in Milwaukee, but he did find a job at the Armor Meatpacking plant in Chicago, so he was only home on weekends. Mom's grandmother, a German immigrant with only a 4th grade education, held the family together by working double shifts, morning and evening, as a janitress in downtown Milwaukee. My parents got to ride the post-war prosperity wave up into the academic middle class, but they also never forgot where they came from. My sisters and me, we were taught to respect honest working people of every race and ethnicity at least as much, maybe more than rich people. And Mom in particular had a strong interest in environmental issues, which is why back in the late 1970s, when I was only 10 or 11 years old, I was already reading in the Environmental Action Journal and the Greenpeace Examiner about agricultural workers getting poisoned by pesticides, or chemical or nuclear plant workers facing horrific toxic workplaces, working class neighborhoods like Love Canal suffering from toxic wastes, and so on. I was horrified. It stuck with me. Years later, I was working on a history dissertation on air pollution control in post-war America. And looking at old congressional hearings, I saw again and again labor representatives going against industrial employers and lobbyists to testify strongly in favor of federal air pollution control. So then I checked water pollution hearings, same story. Then I tried some other sorts of hearings like wilderness preservation, same story. Now, this was back in the early 1990s when everybody assumed that environmentalists and workers were, fundamentally enemies forever. Now, I knew that wasn't entirely true back in the 1970s, just from personal memory. But I was seeing a different pattern in the 50s and 60s too. I presented my results at a history conference in 1995. The commenters told me that what I was saying was simply impossible. A journal editor and his reviewers felt the same initially, but I didn't back down because I knew I was right. And as it turned out, some other scholars' manuscripts started moving through the pipeline around the same time to help prove that. 20 years later, Oxford University Press invited me to write their entry on American working class environmentalism. I was flattered. I was also hoping it was going to be a quick, easy project where I could just update my earlier research and be done with it. Wrong. Although working class environmental history is still a young field, a lot of people have done a lot of interesting work in it from pre-Civil War times up through pretty much yesterday. So there's a lot of material now, and it wound up being a big project, but interesting and educational. So for instance, historians have traced African-American slaves' special relationship with their natural surroundings, which helped them to survive and sometimes to escape. The US mostly didn't have a British-style wage-dependent working class before the Civil War, but that did start appearing earlier in New England. So already in 1840s Boston, for instance, you find sort of an early environmental justice campaign where workers went against their employers and private interests to join other reformers to support safe, healthy municipal drinking water for rich and poor alike. Already back then, working people saw decent water as a basic human right. After the Civil War, vast immigration and industrialization produced a lot of gritty, polluted industrial cities with foul rivers and covered in coal smoke. Not just Pittsburgh. Many working people had to struggle just to survive. But some still found the time and energy to join reformers in the movement for public parks and playgrounds that poor people too could enjoy. Some also went against their employers to call for cleaner air. Cities like Milwaukee and Minneapolis even elected socialist mayors who tried to fight smoke pollution during the years before World War I. Now, I won't claim that all working people in the late 1800s were already environmentalists. I mean, throughout the whole American class structure, most people back then generally favored the idea of rapid economic growth and the prosperity and resulting jobs, even if it meant recklessly tearing through a whole continent of natural resources and living in those gritty industrial cities. For a lot of people, both rich and poor, belching smokestacks were symbols of prosperity and human progress, and certainly jobs. Now, these lumberjacks posing on the huge tree stump weren't forced to do so by wicked capitalists. No, they were totally proud of what they had done and all the resulting jobs, construction, and board feet of lumber that would come out of it. They weren't worrying about deforestation back then, probably. And it's always been hard to study poor and working people in history. Why? Because they typically left fewer documents for us historians to look at. Documents about working people often come from upper class observers who've often looked down on working people. So you have to try to filter out the class bias to try to figure out what was really going on. But any evidence of early working class environmentalism I find suggestively interesting because it challenges sometimes patronizing myths about working people, such as working people were too busy struggling to survive to worry about environmental reforms or anything else. Working people went along with whatever their employers wanted if it meant jobs. They only thought about wages and work hours. Those are sort of the established myths, I think. But early evidence of working people supporting environmental reforms shows that, yes, they could think for themselves. They could think about things beyond sheer survival, at least sometimes. And they could actually challenge their employers' views and interests on issues beyond wages and work hours, at least sometimes. Now, it wasn't easy for them to do this. They did have to worry about jobs, wages, and survival, and all too often, brutal union busting by their employers, and so on and so on. So it's really that much more to their credit that they could sometimes reach beyond those immediate concerns and resist their corporate employers and the gritty, frankly, awful world they were creating back then. And anytime you find evidence of such activity, it suggests that there may have been even more of it that we just haven't found yet. And this evidence kind of pops up in a sporadic way. But moving along to more recent times with more historical evidence, in the late 1800s, upper middle class Americans rediscovered wilderness appreciation at places like Yellowstone and Yosemite. It took time and money to visit national parks, and at first, working people mostly couldn't. But working class and immigrant kids joined in the early 20th century nationwide scouting and camping movement. And Jewish summer camps in particular sometimes combined outdoor recreation with radical Marxist labor organizing. For the 1920s, longer weekends and increased mobility, often from the relatively affordable Ford Model T, let some working adults start getting out to wilderness areas for day trips, camping, and sport hunting or fishing. They liked it. So, for instance, working people in New York State strongly supported preserving more state park land during the 20s, and not just New York by any means. Such attitudes helped produce the Depression-era Civilian Conservation Corps, which sent millions of young working class men and some women of all ethnicities from crowded industrial cities out to work on soil forest and wilderness conservation projects throughout rural America and send their wages back to their cash-strapped families. The CCC was wildly popular among working-class Americans. The Great Depression and World War II years brought other major changes for working Americans. In particular, the ordeals of the 1930s and 40s brought new power and legitimacy to organized labor. This allowed labor unions and leaders to broaden their hopes and visions beyond the traditional issues like wages and work hours, to seek reforms to make a better world for all Americans. So more progressive unions sought universal health care and supported the civil rights movement. They sought expanded recreational and educational opportunities for their members and their communities. They also focused more on dangerous or toxic conditions, both in workplaces and wider working class neighborhoods. These new broader concerns led union leaders and members increasingly toward what we today call environmental issues, like air pollution, water pollution, wilderness and open space preservation. The poster child for progressive pro-environmental union leaders was Walter Reuther, the powerful, energetic head of the United Auto Workers, along with his director of recreation and conservation, Olga Madar. They took the UAW way out in front with relatively radical demands for federal legislation on pollution cleanup, wilderness preservation, and other issues. They even called for cars to be kept out of wilderness areas and be made non-polluting. They also supported civil rights progress, racial equality, and other progressive social issues. Such positions challenged corporate interests and industry lobbyists, but it wasn't just the UAW either. Andrew B. Miller, George Riley, and other AFL-CIO representatives regularly supported pollution cleanup and wilderness preservation before Congress during the 1950s and 60s, as well as sometimes state legislatures. Other unions also took pro-environmental positions, notably the International Association of Machinists, the United Steel Workers, and especially the Oil, Chemical, and Atomic Workers, whose citizenship director, Tony Matsuki, remained a lifelong friend of environmentalists. Cesar Chavez of the United Farm Workers led a fight to protect both farm workers and consumers from dangerous pesticides, and also was a lifelong friend of environmentalists. And I should note here, I've been kind of featuring some union leaders of note because it's easier to find photographs of them, but rank and file union members and working people were taking action in various ways at various levels. Also, and I should emphasize the UAW and other powerful labor organizations with large memberships were already out in front on environmental issues and were already worrying about multiple environmental issues back at a time when conservation clubs and early environmental groups were typically much smaller and usually focused just on a single issue, like perhaps only wilderness or only air pollution. So labor unions actually started seeing the bigger picture environmentally and ecologically, putting the pieces together and combining various environmental issues under one institutional roof long before there was anything called an environmental movement, a label that only appeared in the late 1960s. And the UAW stayed out in front. In March 1970, the UAW hosted the nation's first teach-in on the environment at the University of Michigan, more than a month before the bigger, better-known nationwide teach-in we call Earth Day. UAW also sponsored and funded planning for Earth Day. They helped in a big way to make it happen at all. Reuther died in a plane crash not long before Earth Day, but in July 1970, the UAW brought together a large number of labor leaders, students, environmentalists, community organizers, and civil rights leaders to discuss broad social and environmental issues and build on the momentum of Earth Day and build on Reuther's vision of social and environmental progress. Also that year, environmentalists helped pass the Occupational Safety and Health Act. The future looked bright for labor environmental cooperation. But the 1970s brought trouble for the labor movement, for environmentalists, and for the whole nation. The 1970s energy crisis revealed painfully how post-war American prosperity was based in substantial part on lavish, wasteful use of energy plus limited foreign economic competition. Energy scarcity and revived foreign competition threatened economic growth and jobs. American workers, as always, were especially vulnerable to economic downturns and the threat of job loss. Before the 1970s, the labor environmental allies had expected both jobs and environmental progress. The 1970s made workers fear they must choose between jobs or environmental progress. Many worried workers and union leaders listened to corporate arguments that in the economic hard times, the nation just couldn't afford environmental protections. Now, I'll bet many of you have seen the Lord of the Rings movies. Remember that scene from the Council of Elrond where everyone is trying to decide how to get the ring thrown back into the fires of Mount Doom? And the ring is sitting on a little table and there's a weird kind of fisheye lens effect and you see everybody starting to fight and argue among themselves because of the evil power of the ring. Well, think of that scene, then think of the 1970s, and then think neoliberalism. Now, what is neoliberalism? Briefly, it's a quasi-religious belief system that private free market methods are always the best solution to absolutely every aspect of human life. Not just the economic realm, but everything. So public schools should be privatized. Prisons should be privatized. Everything should be privatized. And everything will be better and more efficient if you leave it to the market and the profit motive. Government only exists to ensure the privatization of everything else and to protect private property. If there's democratic political backlash against privatization, then politics should be de-democratized. Now, that's brief and simplified, but it's also basically correct. In even simpler terms, you could say neoliberalism seeks a complete reversion to total corporate hegemony, like the 1920s, like the 1880s. Neoliberalism dates back at least to the late 1940s, but it surged into prominence in the 1970s and after, rejecting the liberal reforms and radicalism of the 1960s and riding the wave of American conservative political backlash. Neoliberalism has dominated American political and economic discourse ever since, unfortunately. And neoliberalism also hates labor unions and environmental regulations. It hates unions because they interfere with the free market and freedom of contract between employers and workers. Never mind that in reality, this so-called freedom of contract gives concentrated corporate power the chance to exploit workers. Neoliberals worship the theory of the free market, and according to that theory, unions have no right to exist. And neoliberals believe that environmental problems will be magically solved by market forces, so there's no need for environmental regulations or for environmentalists. They've been effective propaganda mouthpieces for corporate interests for many years by now, telling Americans that basically giving unlimited power to corporations is really the right thing to do. Neoliberals and their corporate paymasters also figured out clever ways to trick and trap both sides of the former Labor Environmental Alliance, posing as one side's friend and fingering the other as an enemy. Neoliberals were quite happy to stir up hatred of environmentalists among American workers, blaming environmentalists for costing jobs while glorifying the corporations as benevolent providers of jobs. This helped lead many workers into united fronts with corporate management against environmentalists. But environmental regulations never caused most of the job loss. Globalization did. Environmental regulations were only an afterthought for corporations already planning to move operations abroad to exploit dirt cheap non-union labor wherever they could, as soon as they could. But internationally mobile corporations gladly offered environmentalism as scapegoats to blame, to help conceal who was really to blame for the cratering of US manufacturing and the rise of the Rust Belt. Corporate neoliberals also were gunning for labor unions from day one because, remember, they think unions have no right to exist. Reagan's gratuitous breaking of the air traffic controllers strike in 1981, which of course had nothing to do with environmentalists in particular, was just one dramatic moment in a decades-long campaign of union busting that basically is still going on today. Remember, back to the 1880s. As to environmentalists, to some extent, well, corporations kind of bought some of them. This may have started out innocently enough. I mean, at the time of Earth Day, even some corporate executives probably sincerely felt that, hey, you know what? American corporations should step up for the environment, same as other people. We're all in it together. But how it worked in practice, at least sometimes, was in the 1970s, some of the major nationwide environmental groups started receiving funding grants from corporate philanthropic foundations like the Ford and Rockefeller foundations. But as always, he who pays the piper calls the tune in the end. The major environmental groups gradually grew more quasi-corporate in their structure and fundraising and more dependent upon like corporate foundation grants, and increasingly tended to practice the kind of environmentalism that corporations could feel more comfortable with, that is moderate and non-radical. In particular, many of them lost their earlier interest in worker health and safety. One major environmental group of the 1970s, Environmental Action, which helped organize the first Earth Day, continued agitating about toxic workplaces and other working class environmental issues. It also never received corporate foundation grants, and it struggled to survive through the 1980s and 90s. And there are also examples of smaller such groups that tried to buck the corporate trend and struggled to survive. There was a long game plan behind stirring up trouble between labor and environmentalists, and to mix metaphors, I refer to this as the Empire Strikes Back. Already in 1971, Lewis Powell, a tobacco industry lawyer and crony of Richard Nixon and the US Chamber of Commerce, later on the US Supreme Court, wrote the Powell Memorandum, laying out a plan for corporate America to squelch 60s radicalism and regain political and cultural control of the nation by systematically funding pro-corporate, pro-free enterprise, think tanks, media events, professorships, and such, and so dominate discourse again in the United States. So the Reason Foundation, the Olin Foundation, the American Enterprise Institute, the Cato Institute, and so on. Such groups have worked overtime for decades by now to bash unions and environmentalists, and have done so quite successfully. They're very well funded, very well connected, and of course, by this point, neoliberals have taken control of the US Supreme Court and, well, have a lot of power in both houses of Congress, to put it mildly. Now, neoliberals like to pose as pseudo-populists, claiming to be the best friend of working Americans by protecting them from both unions and environmentalists. In swallowing neoliberal poison that made them see each other as enemies, unions got played, environmentalists got played, working Americans got played, and neoliberals ran laughing all the way to the bank. And basically, the extent to which workers and environmentalists are enemies is the extent to which neoliberalism has won. Frodo has failed. Yet, cooperation between the labor movement and environmentalists never completely went away, although there were certainly some difficult years. Wisconsin was one place where some environmental labor cooperation continued even through the dark decades of the 1980s and 90s, and not the only place. Certainly other examples around the country. Such cooperation drew little media attention until the Blue-Green Alliance protesters dramatically disrupted the 1999 Seattle meeting of the World Trade Organization, which is sort of like a high temple of global neoliberalism, if you will. The Battle of Seattle suggested that the former allies might be reconsidering just who their friends and enemies really were. And certainly history marches on, but I think I'll leave it there and open up for questions and comments and everything else. But thank you. I should.
Jackie? We'll move into the panel now. Jackie Kelly.
Yes. All right. Well, thank you to Scott Dewey for that so insightful and interesting history. A lot of stuff that I definitely didn't know. That was wonderful. That was really great. Thank you so much. We've also assembled a panel to further enrich this discussion. So joining us today is Dennis Delie, Secretary Treasurer of the Wisconsin AFL-CIO. Marc Rosenthal of the Sierra Club, and Pam Fendt, the president of the Milwaukee Area Labor Council. So I'm going to start with Dennis. Could you share any reaction to what we heard from Scott, and also speak about labor's role in the environment in regards to the paper industry here in Wisconsin?
Sure. And again, thanks for having me. Very interested by some of Scott's comments, and they fit quite well with some of the remarks that I'm about to make. I've been the Secretary Treasurer for the Wisconsin State AFL-CIO now for 3.5 years, but prior to that, I spent 44 years working at a Green Bay paper mill. And as we probably know, paper mills are certainly environmentally challenged. In my years at the paper mill, for 41 of those years, I was a union representative in one capacity or another. For the final 19 years that I was there, I was the local union president. And, we often dealt with and often talked about the challenges that faced our individual facility, oftentimes because of environmental issues. And we were fortunate to be part of the United Steelworkers International Union, a union that understood the importance of being good stewards of the environment, and that we couldn't have good jobs without also taking care of the environment. And I'll touch on that a little bit later. Obviously this industry is extremely important to Wisconsin. In Green Bay, for example, there are 3 mills at the mouth of the Fox River within a 1/4 mile of each other. And that continues to be the case up and down the river and across the entire state in places like Appleton, Kaukauna, Neenah, Park Falls, Peshtigo, Wisconsin Rapids, Wausau. The list just goes on and on. There are paper companies and facilities all across this state, and they provide a huge economic impact to the state of Wisconsin, to the tune of about $18.2 billion in economic output, and currently employs in the neighborhood of 30,000 workers. That, by the way, is down significantly. There was a time when that number was more like 60,000 workers. So, and then when you factor in all the related jobs and, with suppliers and indirect jobs, it swells up to, in the neighborhood of 95,000 jobs. Again, the unions, as well as, some of the companies, recognize that they couldn't continue down the current path of basically being a dirty, stinky, labor-intensive industry. And over time, many of them have evolved into, what today are relatively clean, very efficient, and technical places to work and produce products. There's a downside to that, however. This evolution finds these plants producing more paper than they ever did before. And they're able to do that with oftentimes less raw materials, and unfortunately, in many cases, less workers. And this contraction, this evolution has led to a lot of mergers within the industry, where places used to be standalone facilities. Now they may be part of a larger corporation. And this, in many cases, has resulted in a lot of plant closures. And these closures are absolutely devastating to the communities that they reside in, where oftentimes they're the largest employer, paying the highest wages and benefits. And that filters on down again to all the indirect businesses and jobs that are also tied to that specific paper mill. For example, in Wisconsin, the logging industry has been severely impacted by mill closures to the point where it's becoming extremely difficult for them to even survive. If you look at the recent closure of the Verso paper mill up in Wisconsin Rapids, they were just an absolute huge consumer of timber. And that in itself has significantly impacted the logging industry up in that part of the state. I would like to talk a little bit about a facility here in Green Bay that's pretty near and dear to my heart, and that is the Georgia Pacific Day Street plant that Georgia Pacific recently announced that they intend to close that plant over the course of the next 18 months. And to give you a little bit of history about that plant and the challenges it faced, many of which are environmental, I'll give you a little bit of history on that. So, and by the way, this is also the mill where my father worked, and it's also the work where I worked for 44 years. So it's a mill with 121-year history. It was the birthplace of northern bath tissue, currently called quilted northern bath tissue. It's a plant that's provided excellent wages, benefits, and job security for generations of workers. It's not uncommon in these mills, and this mill isn't alone, where you have in some cases 3-4 generations within the same family have come through that plant, and this mill was no exception. Through acquisitions and mergers, what started out as a northern paper mill eventually transitioned from a standalone facility to becoming part of Georgia Pacific stable, which now numbers in the neighborhood of 270 paper facilities. And at that time, they changed the name of that plant from Northern to the Day Street Mill. And like a lot of places, as an organization becomes larger and larger, individual pieces of that become more insignificant. And that certainly became the case with the Day Street Mill. As they became part of a larger and larger company, the focus changed to which facility could deliver product to the customer at the lowest possible cost. And it was not unusual to see paper or finished product shipped up to the Green Bay area and across Wisconsin and the Midwest from places like Alabama, Louisiana. They would ship that either raw materials or finished product up into this area. Ultimately, that impacted production volume at the Day Street Mill. And throughout the years, production volume continued to be shifted away from that mill, due in large part because there was just a significant lack of investment over the years, investment that would have been needed to keep that mill competitive. And it's not only competitive with corporations that are making the same products, but competitive within their own company, and as and how they stacked up to their sister facilities across the country. The employees at this mill knew that their equipment was getting old. They had an aging pulp mill that had significant environmental issues, like all pulp mills do. And that the mill needed some significant investment in order to keep competitive. And unfortunately, they had a series of owners that were either unable or reluctant to invest the necessary capital, despite the fact that the mill had a long-standing history of being very profitable, and it didn't seem to matter who owned them. But nothing had a more direct impact on the long-term viability of that Day Street Mill that in 1997, when they became linked through acquisition again with what was then Fort Howard Paper Company, which was also located in Green Bay, about a mile down the Fox River. The new company was now called Fort James, and they now had 2 mills in the same town. At this point, Day Street probably had 450 to 500 employees, with the Fort Howard Mill, now called the Broadway Mill, having in excess of 2,000 employees. So one relatively small mill compared with another mill 4 times its size. And by the way, the Broadway Mill was the only non-union paper mill in Green Bay. In 2000, Georgia Pacific acquired not only the Day Street Mill, but the Fort Howard Mill. The company at that time was called Fort James. Georgia Pacific is a company with very deep pockets, thanks to its owners, the Koch brothers. And to hear Scott talk about neoliberalism, I suspect if you look that up in the dictionary, you may see a picture of the Koch brothers, because there isn't anybody that exemplifies that more than they do. The union at the time was very much aware of the need to somehow attract some capital investment if we hope to survive in the same town as the much larger non-union mill. And again, these neoliberalists were of the opinion that unions didn't belong messing with their business. So I think, really the writing was on the wall that that we needed to do something. Despite our best efforts, the Broadway Mill would go on to see significant investment from Georgia Pacific, even though, quite frankly, they had more significant environmental issues than the Day Street Mill did. They burned coal, which was much more of a polluter than the gas-fired plant at Day Street. They were directly tied to the PCB contamination of the Fox River in Green Bay, which was one of the biggest environmental tragedies in this country. And but despite all that, they continued to attract significant investment. Ended up getting a new paper machine installed. Paper machines, by the way, back when they got that one, was probably $250,000. They're upwards of $500,000 nowadays. And then on top of that, there was another $150 million in updates that came along within recent years, including a new gas-fired power plant, which eliminated their reliance on coal. At the same time, the Day Street Mill continued to see minimal investment. And again, it was no surprise when this decision came down this past December. Well, really, the decision followed an announcement in December that GP was going to invest another $500 million. That's 500 million as in $500 million in the Broadway Mill. And like many folks, I suspected this could be the dagger in the heart of the Day Street Mill, and it proved to be. So, all in all, a very disappointing series of events for that Day Street Mill. Part and parcel to the challenges that face that mill and many other mills in the state and really across the country is this legacy of ongoing environmental issues in paper. And our union, the United Steelworkers, recognized that we couldn't ignore these issues if jobs were to survive, and partnered with the Sierra Club to form the Blue Green Alliance in 2006, an alliance that continues until today. It has united labor unions across the country. There are currently 14 different unions and environmental organizations that have united in this alliance, and they are guided by the principle that we can't choose between good jobs and a clean environment, that the actions we take to create good quality jobs and to protect working people and the environment must go hand in hand, and that together we can build a clean, thriving, and fair economy. So settled quite a bit there. I think I'll stop right here. And again, thanks for the opportunity.
All right, thank you, Dennis. So our next panelist is Marc Rosenthal from the Sierra Club. So Marc, could you share any reactions to what we've heard so far today, and as well speak a bit about pipelines, jobs, and also anything about how that might interact with the land rights of Wisconsin's Indigenous peoples?
All right. Can you hear me? All right. Well, thanks very much for the opportunity to talk to you. I do work with Sierra Club. I'm a member. I work with like Wisconsin 350, but my political home is really the People's Green New Deal, an eco-socialist group that I've worked with for some years. And we're part of broader coalitions that certainly include actively like the Sierra Club, and Elizabeth Ward of the Sierra Club asked me if I would do this presentation. One thought off of what I just heard is how important this discussion is to the things that I want to talk about, because we've been told far too often that political figures, particularly Democratic political figures, won't support our work around line 3, line 5, these environmental issues, because of their fear of alienating their labor allies, particularly within the construction unions or others, but they simply won't touch it out of concern for alienating labor. So I think this is an incredibly critical conversation. So I'm going to start where I'll just say I'm a retired emergency room nurse. I worked as a member of SEIU and SEIU 1199, following in the footsteps of my mother, who was a lifelong trade union activist. I also have several family members who are currently organizers in the labor movement. I'm now doing street medicine with homeless folks in Madison, Wisconsin. We've spent many years promoting public health and working for social justice. The labor movement has a long and proud history as part of that struggle. Today, I am talking to that labor movement, talking about doing the right thing, not the easy thing. I've often spoken of human rights, for instance, the right to health care and clean water. But today I want to speak not of rights, but of obligations. The obligation to defend and protect the land and all things that are of it. I wish to speak today in defense of northern Wisconsin and of my children's future. I want to talk about Line 5, owned by Enbridge, one of the largest, most powerful corporations in the world. Line 5, the pipeline begins in Alberta, Canada, runs to Superior, Wisconsin, crosses northern Wisconsin and the Straits of Mackinac, goes to the Straits of Mackinac, then continues through Michigan back to Canada. Built in 1953, it transports an average of 540,000 barrels of mostly tar sands oil. Tar sands is some of the dirtiest oil in the world. It is a climate time bomb. 90% of Line 5 oil is not used in the United States. It's used in Canada. Enbridge is seeking to reroute a segment of Line 5 through more than 180 waterways in Wisconsin that flow into the Bad River Band's wild rice beds and fisheries on Lake Superior. This despite the Bad River Band's very strong opposition. Line 5 has been operating illegally for 9 years within the Bad River Reservation because Enbridge's easement on reservation land expired in 2013. And the Bad River Band denied Enbridge's request to renew it due to the risk of catastrophic spills. The Bad River Band repeatedly called for Enbridge to leave the watershed, but instead Enbridge has proposed a 41-mile reroute of the pipeline through all the major tributaries that flow into the Bad River Reservation. Enbridge proposes to abandon the old pipeline, leaving highly toxic artifacts that would require monitoring. This is illegal in Canada. However, it is legal in the United States. The union jobs that require skill and training to install pipelines are the very same ones that are required to remove pipelines. The decommission of a pipeline creates about half as many jobs as construction of a new pipeline. but deconstruction of all of Line 5 would create a large number of highly skilled union jobs along with the recovery of scrap metal. The DNR, Wisconsin, just ended a period for comments on its preliminary environmental impact April 15th. The report does not capture who and what Enbridge is. Enbridge has a violent and arrogant track record. It spends millions to create a social license. It lobbies, buys, and divides communities. It uses its money and influence to push state legislatures to criminalize nonviolent protests and oppositions to its actions. Enbridge makes promises it does not keep. In North Dakota, where it invested in the Dakota Access Pipeline, DAPL, it was responsible for paramilitary violence against nonviolent protesters. Recently in northern Minnesota, Enbridge bought and militarized police departments to stop protests against construction of tar sands pipeline 3. Opposition was led by the Anishinaabe, whose treaty rights the line violated. Over 1,000 people were arrested, some still facing very serious prison sentences. Once granted permits in Minnesota, Enbridge simply did as it pleased, causing frackouts on 28 rivers. Frackouts occur with horizontal directional drilling, the use of drilling mud mixed with undisclosed chemicals under pressure to drill a tunnel under waterways, where the drilling mud escapes into subsurface waters that can then reach surface waters. Enbridge failed to follow its own construction plans, digging deeper than allowed, and this flawed construction work led to the piercing of 3 aquifers and at least 280 million gallons of groundwater being illegally released. In the middle of a drought about a year ago, they illegally took and used water as they chose. The preliminary EIS here in Wisconsin does not mention the environmental devastation that just took place in Minnesota. How is that even possible? Nor is there any mention of Enbridge's long history of pipeline ruptures, oil spills in the Midwest, I'm sorry. Oil spills in Wisconsin would threaten the Great Lakes and 186 waterways. Line 5 has already spilled 1.1 million gallons of oil. When the governor of Michigan, recently concerned about the Straits of Mackinac, demanded that Line 5 be shut down, Enbridge simply refused. Enbridge and its supporters state that they have respected the wishes of the Bad River Chippewa. This is not true. Enbridge has a history of total disregard for Indigenous sovereignty and uses an Enbridge initiative called Opposition Driven Operational Threats, ODOT, to track Indigenous opposition. Indigenous peoples are seen and treated as targets, as a threat. The preliminary EIS states there is nothing uniquely different about the project or the proposed environmental effects. Nothing could be farther from the truth. Both construction and spills of a new Line 5 segment would cause devastation to Copper Falls State Park, the Kakagon Sloughs, the entire Bad River Reservation, Lake Superior, and the Apostle Islands. Enbridge says that rerouting Line 5 will not affect climate change. To suggest that updating the existing line to establish, to suggest that updating the existing line to enable tar sands oil to flow and be burned for many more years does not affect climate change is simply a lie, using the manipulation of language. Governor Tony Evers' task force on climate change contained 55 recommendations, including building no new fossil fuel infrastructure. We are facing an existential crisis with climate change. We are in a climate emergency, meaning that climate change is an urgent threat to the well-being of people and all living things worldwide and must be addressed immediately. Our current trajectory of global emissions and warming puts us above even the worst projections of the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And if it continues, it is likely to threaten the very underpinnings of our civilization. And that is not a fringe view. Large segments of the planet will simply be uninhabitable. We are seeing warming feedback loops that will lead to runaway warming, and we are at multiple tipping points now. For example, the melting of Arctic ice. We are in The sixth great extinction with rates of extinction 1,000 times higher than background rates. The UN warns of mass dislocation in 30 years of up to 1.2 billion refugees due to extreme weather events, rising seas, famine, and war. This is a social justice issue. The people who are affected by climate change and who will be most affected in the future are the poor and communities of color here in the United States and worldwide. These are the people who have historically contributed the very least to the emissions that are causing warming. So I want you to imagine the level of human suffering and stress on remaining social and governmental bodies with the dislocation of over 1 billion people. Very soon, 30 years. This will simply change everything as we know it, and I fear that the global response will be some form of authoritarian fascism. Nations need to move away faster from fossil fuels for humankind to retain any hope of preventing a perilous future on an overheated planet, according to a major new report on climate change that was just released April 4th. This is a climate emergency. Delay means death, said United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres, adding, this is an important part, adding that wealthy economies and corporations are not just turning a blind eye, they're adding fuel to the flames. They are choking our planet based on their vested interest in historic investments in fossil fuels when cheaper renewable solutions provide green jobs, energy security, and greater price stability. Unions must demand that our infrastructure turn to green, sustainable jobs, not short-term boom and bust destruction. We need the labor movement as an ally to meet this climate emergency. The history of labor is filled with hard choices made, forging links on a chain of struggle. Which side are you on mattered then, and it matters now. We have an obligation to act. I know this can be incredibly overwhelming, and if you are concerned about climate change, but just don't know what to do, in Wisconsin, we have an opportunity. We can make real, strategic, not symbolic change by stopping Line 5. Speaking on behalf of my children and grandchildren's future, I ask that Wisconsin deny this permit to Line 5. We must not sell our future to the last and most expensive tar sand pipeline in history. Thank you for the opportunity to share this.
All right, thank you, Marc. That gave us like a ton to think about. And finally, Pam Fendt, president of the Milwaukee Area Labor Council. Could you share any thoughts on what we've heard so far today, and also talk about the relationship between jobs and the natural environment?
Thank you very much, Jackie, and thank you to everyone for inviting me to be on this panel. Thank you, Professor Dewey, for your wonderful presentation. It set such a good pace for our day. As you talked about the neoliberalism strategy to divide and conquer, those of us that live in Wisconsin are highly cognizant of the use of that strategy to separate public and private sector unions under Scott Walker's administration in the state of Wisconsin. My colleague Chris from Laborers Local 113 and I were some of the people who organized a lot of building trades members who were not at all affected by Walker's initial actions, but we knew that if he was coming for the private sector, if he was coming for the public sector, he'd be coming for the private sector as well. And that proved to be true when they took away state prevailing wage and they took away, when they enacted right to work. But we brought busloads and carfuls of people repeatedly to the Capitol in solidarity. So that brought back memories when you talked about divide and conquer. I also like the part about talking about respect for all working people. And certainly whenever I'm giving a speech, as I'm the research director for the Laborers Union in Wisconsin, I'm cognizant that my wages are paid by working people's dues. And that includes people who work pipeline in Wisconsin. And it's not an insignificant number of hours. Our union, the Laborers, is partnered in reshaping America's energy future with jobs for the 21st century. The Laborers International Union of North America supports an all-of-the-above energy strategy. Currently, the US is dependent on oil and natural gas. Roughly 2/3 of our energy today comes from those sources. That doesn't only affect in terms of jobs the laborers, but people in the pipe trades and the Teamsters. As we look to find new sources of energy, we agree that the solution to climate change is comprehensive climate change legislation. And the Laborers Union has been on the forefront of supporting climate change legislation with aggressive carbon reduction targets. I know we've got folks working on this in Capitol Hill. We worked hard on the infrastructure bill, which brought certain aspects that we're going to need, but when Build Back Better did not go through in its entirety, the need to make sure that the climate piece gets done is something that we're still working on. In fact, I came on with the laborers 12 years ago when our union undertook a large endeavor around green jobs that was tied to the stimulus package that the Obama administration put together during the Great Recession. So we're investing in energy development. This is long overdue, but it has the potential of creating hundreds of thousands of good green jobs. The American Society of Civil Engineers awarded U.S. energy infrastructure a D+ in 2013 and found a $107 billion investment gap in our electricity infrastructure. And we know closing that gap would help create new career pathways. Electric vehicle infrastructure is a big part of the infrastructure bill. And there was just a bid issued by the city of Milwaukee for changing over of city light sources to LED. And that's going to create new electrician positions. That's all very exciting. But I do think that we need to be to recognize with the fact that 2/3 of our current energy production is in oil and natural gas, that we do need to understand that it's a tradition, it's a transition, that we can't simply flip the switch. We're working hard on putting up as many solar fields and wind farms in the state as possible. There's many interesting projects on the docket with the Wisconsin Public Service Commission, but it will be a transition. And as we talk about this in a labor history context, I think current history is important to note that in a pipeline project that was performed in Dennis's part of the world from Plymouth to Chilton last year, there were 15,000 work hours on that project that paid nearly $1 million in wages and benefits. And that's just to laborers alone. A larger project, the Lakeshore Lateral, went through local 464 and local 113 areas. This project had 88 laborers at peak. Again, that's not counting other trades that were present. 104,000 work hours, totaling $5.6 million in wages and benefits to Wisconsin workers. So these are not insignificant numbers. I did want to just correct one thing that Marc's noted, that the line 5 is light crude and liquid natural gas. It's not tar sands. So I understand the fear of that energy source, but that part of what he said isn't actually true. So I think that when we think about this transition, one of the things that we need to talk about is a phrase called just transition. And I know that's, I'm a stakeholder on the group that's putting together Governor Evers' clean energy plan that was just released, as is Dennis. And if we don't take care of the workers who are currently doing pipeline work, we're going to have an issue where we're back to the spotted owls versus the loggers. And we don't want that. We don't need the kind of violence that took place in Minnesota. A friend of mine who's a laborer actually stated at the last AFL-CIO convention that he put a statement out on Facebook and said, "Is it wrong to throw rocks and sticks at workers?" He's from Minnesota. That's the level it was getting to there. We don't want to see that in Wisconsin. We don't want to see workers demonized. I went to the hearing that you spoke about, Marc, where the bill about protest on energy sites. And as I was leaving, a member of an environmental group told me that because of my testimony, she hopes that my children drink the water that we poison and die. So we can be part of the solution to dial down the rhetoric and look at the pathway to everybody wants a clean energy solution. However, some of the first solar fields that were put up in Wisconsin with ribbons cut by Governor Evers and Lieutenant Governor Mandela Barnes, who's a leader on these issues, had majority non-Wisconsin workers on site, and they weren't paid to the scale that other union workers in the utility industry are paid. So we do not want the transition to clean energy sources to be creating a new lower wage second tier workforce without the wages and benefits and union protections that utility workers currently have. And so I'm really happy to be able to be here today to speak on behalf of workers doing this work. And in Milwaukee, we working closely with the organizer for the Blue-Green Alliance. I've appeared on many Blue-Green panels and online webinars, and we're working really hard to make sure that the new jobs equal the old jobs in terms of quality, safety, and union protections. Thank you for this opportunity.
All right, well, thank you to all three of our panelists for sharing all these different perspectives and really enriching this discussion. Does anybody in attendance today have any questions for our keynote speaker and panelists? Mark Catlin, I saw you had something in the chat, but it looked like Ken addressed it kind of already. I don't know if anybody has anything further on Mark's question, which was, how successful was the national and Wisconsin OSHA environmental network in the 1980s in building partnerships in Wisconsin and across the USA? And then Ken noted in the comments that here in Wisconsin, they had formed a network that was credited with passage of the Wisconsin Recycling Act, which was one of the first in the nation.
Yeah, I can comment on that just very briefly. And actually, we started with Dominic D'Ambrosio, who was president of the then Allied Industrial Workers International Union, which was based in Milwaukee. It's now part of the steel workers. And Dom worked with Tony Earl at that time, who was also known for his environmental background, and formed this network of environmentalists and unionists. And one of the things that we were able to do was to, because one of the major issues was that there was a plan to have a deposit law here in Wisconsin at that time, so that you'd that there'd be a 10 or 5 cent charge on every can of soda or beer or bottle that you used. And that was, and we had a number of steelworker plants here in Wisconsin at that time that made cans for the soda and beer industry. And out of that, we didn't want that law passed because it would cost jobs. So we sat down with our friends from the Sierra Club and other environmental organizations, tried to build a common ground, and found that in recycling. And therefore, we were able to go hand in hand to the state legislature, unionists and environmentalists, and support passage of the Wisconsin recycling law, which at the time it was passed was one of the major accomplishments, one of the first in the nation. And that is documented in a book by a professor in Boston, I believe now, but by the name of Brian Oback.
Steve, did you have a comment or question?
Yes, and this goes to Scott or any of the panelists for that matter too. I understand that Senator Rick Scott has a proposal that would sunset all federal regulation every 5 years, and that Ron Johnson supports that measure. And I'm just curious as to what, if you're familiar with it, and if so, what impact that would have on both environmental regulation and labor regulations.
I should confess I'm not that familiar with it, except in a general way, though I've encountered these sorts of proposals before. My my instinct is to fear that it would tend to have probably a harmful effect on balance, and tend to undercut functioning and constructive regulatory apparatus. That is, I think this kind of proposal typically comes as, I won't say Trumpian, but a sort of anti-regulatory set of mind, that the more regulations we can retire, the better, et cetera, et cetera. With my limited awareness, I tend to feel alarmed a bit, but I defer to others who have more information on the topic, certainly, or are watching it more closely.
All right. Any of the panelists can, if they know anything about this or have any thoughts on it, can jump in. Otherwise, we could take another question from those in attendance today.
This is Judy Gatlin. I just have a comment. I think that solutions to clean energy, working with labor, it's quite generational as well. And I think as organizers, as we get younger people on board with organized labor and the advantages of being represented, they will take a lead in wanting to be part of clean energy. Whereas now when you have a person who's, been doing the same job for 20 years, that's threatened because of regulation or some type of governmental change towards clean energy. Their minds are very closed, very adamant. They just want to finish their time, retire. And we all know we don't blame them for that. But I just think as we get that PRO-Act in and get organized, I think a younger crowd of organized workers is going to help. Maybe just a small way, but I think it's going to help.
So this is Mark. I would just comment on the legislation that was being noted, was that it's simply sort of going back to that neoliberal programming, an attempt to strip us of what sort of federal advances we've made in environmental law. In the same way that there are attempts like the law that was being mentioned before, and I apologize that one of my colleagues may have said something so rude, but the very process or act of protesting is being criminalized. We're talking about a federal trespass bill, which is now law in multiple states, including Wisconsin, which makes it illegal to go on any land that is part of a energy infrastructure. It's a felony. Okay, they just tried to pass a riot law, which would have made any gathering of over 3 people where somebody engaged in a illegal act, which is a widely defined thing, a riot. And therefore, if I was in a crowd of several hundred people in a demonstration and one person engaged in an illegal act, I am now exposed to felony charges. That was called the Riot Bill, which was proposed by the very same forces of the energy corporations that put forth the federal trespass law. The governor just vetoed that bill. And the level, when I just want to say that when I referred to like the militarization of northern Minnesota and the legal thing, I was up there. I was at the Anishinaabe resistance camps trying to stop Line 3 and saw like hundreds and hundreds of highly militarized riot police taking on with dogs, indigenous peoples who were saying, no, this is our land. Treaty rights give us this. it's an exceptionally violent situation. So looking at sort of this legal tech, it's very much like what Alex has done in terms of union and other things. So anyways, enough said. I just wanted to say that attempt to sort of roll back environmental legislations is part of a broader attack. And maybe the last thing I'll say is neoliberalism. I began my work in the 70s in Latin America. Like the war that we're seeing vis-a-vis neoliberalism, that was being visited upon like the third world way before it came here. I was with people in El Salvador who were talking to me about neoliberalism in 1979. So, you know, this is, it's a very, it's a critical struggle that we're into. And thank you, Scott, for talking about neoliberalism, because that's the form in which this struggle is taking place. Thank you.
All right. Are there any more comments or questions from the folks attending today?
I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm Ted Craig, and I work for an affiliate of WEAC Region 7, and I'm involved in climate stuff, especially with Pam Fendt on the Milwaukee City County Task Force in that area. And the question I have is this: I've always perceived that working people in unions have very good reasons to be alarmed about the transition to new energy sources and the steps we need to take on climate, because recent history in the neoliberal era has been really bad. I mean, there's been a lot of broken promises where, okay, your jobs are going to go to Mexico and there's going to be transition assistance, and people end up getting jobs if they're lucky that they cap as much. It's just a really sordid history where people feel very insecure over the last few decades. And one of the things I consider critical is that this isn't just a big empty promise when we say there's going to be good paying union jobs in the new jobs that are created by the climate action we have to take. The question I have, especially for Pam, but for others, is given the policy environment in Wisconsin, where a lot of the things unions are doing, working with environmentalists to assure decent union jobs, like having project labor agreements, are pretty much outlawed, what can be done in the policy environment we have with the current gerrymandered legislature, which apparently will continue for a while? What tools are there available to make sure that it's not an empty promise that good family supporting jobs are going to be created in the clean energy and the efficiency and all the other things that need to be done?
Hey, Pam, this is Chris Oleg. I could probably take a stab at that one there. While PLAs are considered taboo within the state of Wisconsin right now, they are not out of the realm of possibility when we deal with the owners directly. So the owners of the projects are allowed to go into PLA situations with any of the trade unions that they so see fit.
Okay. Or Pam, you're, oh yeah, okay. Pam, you're unmuted, but we can't hear you. Is your device connected to your computer? Yep.
Oh.
Pam,
Is that?
Oh, now we can hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, great. So Chris was mentioning project labor agreements with private entities, and we're working on, I believe it's a 300 megawatt solar farm in Racine County under an agreement, and that'll be hiring hundreds of laborers at our scale. And that's a great step forward it took a lot of internal organizing and pressure on the company, but certainly the actions of the Biden administration relative to the infrastructure bill and his support for these being union jobs has been a helpful, when politicians use the bully pulpit in the right way, that sets a good stage. But we negotiated with a company that doesn't always build union, but this large solar farm with the battery storage in Racine. It's either in Racine or Kenosha County, but there's already been a pre-job with the company, and we're starting to get laborers on it. One wrinkle that's coming up is there's a petition for tariffs on foreign-made solar panels, which of course we all want domestic manufacturing to be revived. And as President Biden said on the campaign trail, why can't these solar panels be made in the United States? We want to support that, but the tariff proposal right now could be a 200% tax up even on solar panels that have already been purchased. So it's having a chilling effect. I was just on a regional call with the laborers yesterday. A lot of projects are getting put on hold as this gets sorted out in DC. So how do we support the transition to having it be made in America, made in Wisconsin, even better, but not stop these projects from going forward. So everybody's on hold because now that changes the dollars and cents of their projects if there would be this tariff on even on equipment that's already purchased. So that has to get sorted out. We hope it happens this summer sooner rather than later. So that's another aspect of what's going on with the transition right now.
Hey, I wanted to jump in quickly just to say that I thought Ted's questions were very good and troubling, and the other participants who've already responded can speak much more effectively to this particular context you're working with in the state of Wisconsin. It made me think, well, this is something that some faculty members at the University of Minnesota, where I work, talk about often. And it's kind of like more of a dream probably in the Wisconsin or US context than a reality, at least around the corner. But they often point to nations that have quite successfully introduced like retraining programs and options to help workers transition between industries, between changes in industry. One classic example being Denmark, I can name, but others doing the same thing. And of course, that's partly state action, I mean, government action, which is hard to imagine in the United States, unfortunately, but nevertheless, hopefully successful models like that have actually helped workers, not just be dropped on the pavement when an industry pulls out, but have options to move forward in various potential directions, might be one that finally will seep into the American political consciousness, I hope, over time, but we're not there yet, certainly.
Jillian, did you have a comment on this?
Thanks, Jackie. And Steve, you just inadvertently sort of answered my question, or I guess my concern, because when we went about organizing this conference, something that I really pushed for was having the voices of Indigenous people, which Marc so eloquently did, and that was really exciting to have him. Remember, Marc, I taught you yoga. Kathy Evers was in that class all the time too. I miss that. But like hearing, and I'm working class background from Wisconsin, and my work is on this area. But one of the things that I've looked to in my own work is like just what Steve said, which is looking towards Indigenous communities for their land practices and understanding, right? Because we're seeing in all these places that the drought is affecting. So like realistic climate change is so evident, like all over the Eastern Horn of Africa, where communities of people are working together to come up with strategies that operate on the local level that are more environmentally friendly, and sort of like they're having to deal with it right now. And I feel like obviously I'm with Pam and caring about jobs and our workers, and outsourcing is an issue. But if we can all agree that neoliberalism is the problem and come up with solutions as quickly as possible, I think it's very, very necessary, because the planet doesn't care whether or not like workers have their jobs. Like, I mean, it's kind of dire that we respond to this right away. Okay, I'll shut up.
All right. Anything in response? Any further new questions from the attendees today?
I'll just say, Jackie, that I know my union and the electricians are really on the forefront of trying to figure this out. And are definitely already in the midst of transitioning to a new, cleaner economy. I just, it's the pace of the transition that we need to speed up. And then there's all the details that we need to be mindful of along the way.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, I think that's about everything everybody wanted to say. Oh, wait, Mark, go ahead.
Well, I just want to honor the fact that these are very difficult things, okay? These affect people's lives. But I also want us to remember our history. People died in this struggle. People were murdered for being trade union people. People went on strike and lost their jobs and went hungry. I've been on strike. I've had it been very difficult to pay my rent. My mother has been on strike multiple times and had difficulty, paying our rent when I was growing up. And those are small things compared to what people gave up in the struggle for workers' rights. And, I don't want to pretend that this isn't difficult, but people don't, like scientists don't use words like emergency, existential crisis. Like if we are in the middle of a war for our very existence, we have to think about what our actions are. And what I want to end by is honoring all those brothers and sisters that came before us in this struggle, who made it possible for us to be where we are, and many of whom went hungry, lost families, lost their lives, lost their health, and they put it on the line. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here. Otherwise, we'd still have kids working in mines at the age of 10. So just, I honor those people. And I hope that their sacrifice and their memory is what will give us the strength to make the changes and move forward. Thanks.
All right. So with that, I think we'll conclude this portion of our gathering today. And thank you to all these excellent speakers and all these different perspectives and a good conversation. This was really wonderful, and we're all really appreciate your time here today. So I'm going to turn it over to Labor History Society President Steve Kupari to initiate the annual meeting.
Thank you so much, Jackie. And I just want everybody to stop and think about the respectful conversation that we had with each other. Sometimes we differed over different points that were made, but we showed each other respect. And I hope that we can take that spirit back to our organizations that we're a part of in our communities, and remind people that, for example, those who made the comments to Pam, that's just not an appropriate way to conduct our business. That's not how we're going to win hearts and minds. And the same thing to police that are violent toward demonstrators, that's not an appropriate way to act toward our communities. Let's respect each other. Let's conduct this debate in a civilized manner, and let's try and seek a better solution for all of us. It's been a terrific discussion. Thank you all for participating in it. I hope everybody comes away with the same feeling. We welcome your continued involvement with the Labor History Society and deeper involvement. Glad to see the laborers participating today. And, we'll have some leadership positions open up, I'm sure, in the future within the Labor History Society. And we'd like to see some folks from your organization participate on our board when those opportunities arise. So I think we'll now move into our annual business meeting. But before we do, I just want to remind everybody that we do have on May 1, our Bayview Massacre event. Again, it'll start at 3 o'clock. It'll be at the historical marker site at South Superior and East Russell. And welcome everybody to participate in that important commemoration. Those of you who are not members are certainly welcome to participate in our annual meeting. So feel free